The auditorium was silent, a heavy shroud of disbelief hanging over the elite graduates as the headmaster's voice trembled. Every cent of their crushing tuition debt had been erased, vanished into thin air by an anonymous benefactor. Laughter turned to gasps when the truth emerged. The man responsible wasn't a billionaire alumnus, but the invisible janitor who had swept their floors for years, a man they had spent for years mocking. In the hallowed marble halls of St. Jude's, shadows often hide more than dust. Beneath the frayed collar of a janitor's uniform lay a mind that had once reshaped the world, waiting for the perfect moment to teach one final, life-altering lesson. The sun rose over the iron gates of St. Jude's Academy with a cold, indifferent majesty, casting long skeletal shadows across the manicured lawns. It was a Tuesday, the kind of morning where the biting moisture in the air clung to the skin like a damp, unwanted memory. Arthur moved through the empty, cavernous hallways, long before the first luxury sedan would roll into the circular driveway. The rhythm of his broom was the only heartbeat the building possessed at 5 o'clock in the morning. It was a dry, rhythmic scratching shia sound that Arthur found strangely meditative in the vacuum of the dawn. He watched with a practiced eye as the stiff bristles caught the fine gray dust, sweeping away the remnants of yesterday's arrogance. The discarded candy wrappers and the broken graphite of forgotten pencils. His hands, though aged and webbed with the fine translucent lines of 80 winters, were remarkably steady. Beneath the grime under his fingernails and the lingering, sterile scent of industrial-grade ammonia, there were the lingering ghosts of a vastly different life. These were hands that had once held delicate soldering irons, with surgical precision, and drafted complex blueprints that would have made the world's greatest engineers weep with envy. But here, in the echo chamber of the global elite, he was merely the man who made the mess disappear. He was Arthur, the invisible ghost in the machine. He wore his blue-collared uniform like a suit of armor, the fabric frayed at the cuffs and smelling faintly of wood polish and solitude. To the world, he was a relic of a bygone era, a man whose presence was as unremarkable as the wallpaper. The school itself was a monument to old money and inexorable privilege. The air inside the main foyer always smelled of expensive wood wax, ancient leather-bound books, and the distant metallic temps of the nearby ocean. As the clock struck 8, the silence was shattered by the arrival of the students. They moved in a tidal wave of designer perfumes, crisp linen shirts, and the cacophony of youth that had never known the sting of true deprivation. Among them was Julian, a young man whose family name was etched into the very foundations of the city's financial district. Julian didn't walk. He glided with the effortless confidence of someone who viewed the world as his personal chessboard. Arthur watched from the periphery as Julian and his inner circle gathered near the lockers. Their laughter was sharp, like breaking glass. Julian held an expensive triple-shot latte in one hand, the steam rising in elegant, swirling patterns against the mahogany paneling. He didn't look at Arthur, of course. To Julian, Arthur was a piece of the architecture, a slow-moving obstacle to be navigated. When Julian accidentally brushed against Arthur's cleaning cart, causing a bottle of floor cleaner to tip over and spill a small turquoise puddle onto the pristine marble, the young man didn't apologize. Instead, he looked down at his bespoke leather loafers, his face contorting into a mask of mild annoyance. Julian's words were quiet, but carried the weight of 1,000 insults. He told his friends that it was a tragedy. The school spent so much on tuition, only to have the help cluttering the hallways during peak hours. He joked about Arthur's tattered coat, wondering aloud if the man lived in the supply closet he frequented. Arthur heard it all. He felt the sting, not of the words themselves, but of the sheer casual cruelty behind them. Yet he said nothing. He simply knelt, his knees popping with a sound like dry twigs, and began to soak up the spill with a rag. His mind, however, was miles away, retreating into the sanctuary of his memories. He remembered the laboratory he once owned, a place of glass and steel where the hum of electricity was the soundtrack to his soul. He remembered the night he perfected the micro-energy regulator, a device that had quietly revolutionized renewable power systems across 3 continents. He remembered the wealth that had followed the mahogany desks, the private jets, and the invitations to galas where he was the guest of honor. But most vividly, he remembered the faces of his wife, Eleanor, and his daughter, Sarah. They were the reason he had built his empire. They were also the reason he had walked away from it. After the accident that took them from him, a tragedy that no amount of money or scientific genius could reverse, the glitter of gold had turned to ash in his mouth. He had sold his patents to a global conglomerate for a sum that would sustain 10 generations, but he had kept the money hidden in an impenetrable labyrinth of offshore trusts and anonymous holdings. He didn't want the fame anymore. He wanted the silence. He had chosen St. Jude's not because he needed the meager paycheck, but because he wanted to be near the future. He wanted to see if the next generation was being built on something stronger than just the balance in their father's bank accounts. He retreated to his small sanctuary, the janitor's closet located in the basement. It was a cramped, windowless room, filled with the hum of the Building S, massive boiler, and the scent of damp mops. Here, Arthur would sit, during his lunch break, eating a simple sandwich wrapped in wax paper. On the wall hung a single, framed photograph of Eleanor and Sarah, their smiles frozen in a perpetual state of joy that Arthur could no longer touch. He would look at them and whisper his prayers, seeking the resilience to stay his course. The students saw a man who had failed at life. They saw a man who ate alone in the dark because he had nowhere else to go. They didn't see the man who every evening would return to a modest apartment and spend hours reviewing the financial portfolios of the very students who mocked him. He knew which of them came from families struggling to maintain the facade of wealth. He knew which of them were brilliant, but suffocated by the looming shadow of student loans. He saw the cracks in their gilded lives that they were too proud to show. As the final term approached, the atmosphere at St. Jude's grew electric, with the tension of graduation. The senior class was a mix of triumph and quiet desperation. Behind the designer gowns and the talk of Ivy League futures, there was a dark undercurrent of debt. Even for the wealthy, the cost of St. Jude's was a titan that demanded its due. Julian, despite his bravado, knew his father's empire was crumbling under the weight of bad investments. The tuition bills were late. The prestige was a mask slipping further every day. Arthur observed it all from the shadows, his broom moving with an inexorable grace. He saw the fear in Julian's eyes when he thought no one was looking. He saw the tears of a young girl named Maya, whose parents had told her they could no longer afford her final semester. Arthur didn't feel spite. He felt a profound, bittersweet empathy. He realized that these children were prisoners of their own expectations, trapped in a cycle of greed and pressure that they didn't yet understand. He decided then that the time for silence was over. The patents, the wealth, the legacy IT was all just paper and ink, unless it could change a life. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, encrypted mobile device, his fingers dancing over the keys with a speed that would have shocked anyone who had seen him fumbling with a mop bucket. He sent a single, coded instruction to his lead attorney in London. The wheels of a multi-million-dollar maneuver began to turn, silent and invisible, just like the man who set them in motion. The morning of graduation arrived, not with a celebratory roar, but with a heavy, atmospheric stillness that felt almost liturgical. The great hall of St. Jude's was a cathedral of privilege, its stained-glass windows casting long, kaleidoscopic shards of crimson and violet across the hundreds of rows of polished oak pews. The scent of lilies, cloying and thick, fought for dominance against the familiar, sterile undertone of floor wax. Arthur's silent signature. In the front row, Julian sat with a spine as rigid as the pillars around him. His graduation gown, a deep navy silk that should have felt like a mantle of triumph, instead felt like a leaden weight. Behind his mask of practiced stoicism, his mind was a storm of cold calculations. His father's latest telegram had been blunt. The family's assets were frozen. The tuition for his final semester remained a gaping wound in their financial ledger, a debt that would follow him like a shadow into the world he was supposed to conquer. At the mahogany podium, Dr. Sterling, the headmaster, looked unusually frail. His hands, liver-spotted and trembling slightly, fumbled with a single cream-colored envelope. The microphone picked up the sharp, rhythmic rasp of the paper as he broke the wax seal, a sound that seemed to echo through the cavernous space like a gunshot. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the kind of silence that has a physical weight, a vacuum that sucked the very air from the lungs of every student, parent and faculty member present. Dr. Sterling cleared his throat, the sound a dry, papery rattle that vibrated through the high-fidelity speakers. "I have spent 30 years at this institution," the headmaster began, his voice cracking with an emotion that no one could quite identify. "I have seen the children of kings and the heirs of industry pass through these doors. But today I have been asked to deliver a message that defies every tradition we hold dear." He paused, his gaze flickering toward the back of the hall, where a lone figure in a faded blue uniform stood partially obscured by the shadow of the heavy velvet curtains. Arthur remained there, his hands folded neatly in front of him, his expression as unreadable as an ancient sun-bleached stone. "This morning," Dr. Sterling continued, his voice gaining a strange, rhythmic intensity, "a trust was activated. An anonymous benefactor has settled the accounts of every single student in this graduating class. Tuition, boarding fees, accumulated interest, every cent of debt has been erased. The total sum exceeds $40 million. A collective gasp, a singular, sharp intake of breath, swept through the hall like a gust of wind through a wheat field. For a moment, time seemed to dilate. Julian felt a sudden, violent surge of blood in his ears, rhythmic thrumming that drowned out the murmurs of his classmates. He looked at Maya, 2 seats away, whose face was buried in her hands, her shoulders shaking with the silent, tectonic release of months of hidden terror. The burden was gone. The invisible chains that had threatened to pull them under before they had even begun their lives were shattered. But the headmaster wasn't finished. "The benefactor," he whispered, the word carrying a weight of profound reverence, "requested that I read a short statement. He wished for you to know that wealth is not a destination, but a tool that many of you have used as a weapon of exclusion rather than a bridge of opportunity." Dr. Sterling looked directly at Julian, a piercing, sorrowful look that made the young man's stomach turn. "He wanted you to understand that the person you think is the least among you may very well be the one holding the keys to your future." The headmaster's voice then dropped to a tone of sheer disbelief as he read the final line of the letter. "The funds were provided by the patents of the Vance microenergy regulator. The donor is our own. Arthur Vance." The name Arthur Vance did not belong in a janitor's closet. It belonged in textbooks. It was a name synonymous with the clean energy revolution of the late 90s. A name that had vanished from the public eye, following a tragic accident that had become the stuff of industry legend. The realization rippled through the auditorium, a slow-motion wave of shock that turned heads toward the back of the room. Julian turned, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. There, in the dim light of the exit, stood the man he had mocked, the man whose coffee spill he had refused to acknowledge, the man he had called the help. Arthur did not move toward the stage. He did not seek the applause that was beginning to swell, hesitant at first, then erupting into a deafening, thunderous cacophony. He simply looked at the sea of young faces, the bright, terrified, arrogant, and brilliant future of the world. He saw Julian's eyes, wide and brimming with a sudden, agonizing clarity. In that brief, crystalline moment of eye contact, a silent dialogue passed between them. Arthur wasn't looking for an apology. He was looking for a sign of growth, He saw the way Julian's hand gripped the armrest of his chair, until his knuckles turned witta. Physical manifestation of a soul, finally confronting its own insignificance. The greatest legacy, Arthur had once told his daughter Sarah in a dream, is not the monuments we build in our own names, but the doors we open for those who have no key. He had spent years in these hallways, not as a servant, but as a silent guardian, watching the children of the elite to see who among them might be worthy of a second chance. He had seen their cruelty, yes, but he had also seen their potential, buried under layers of expectation and fear. By removing the debt, he was removing their excuses. He was giving them the one thing his wealth could never buy for himself: a clean slate. As the ceremony dissolved into a blur of tears, handshakes, and frantic whispers, Arthur turned and walked quietly through the heavy oak doors. He didn't wait for the headmaster to catch him. He didn't wait for Julian to find the words he so desperately needed to say. The cool, salt-tinged air of the morning greeted him as he stepped onto the gravel path. He felt lighter than he had in decades. The fortune that had felt like a shroud was now a garden, planted in the minds of hundreds of young people who would, perhaps, walk a little more gently upon the earth. Resilience is not just the ability to survive a storm, but the wisdom to know when to become the rain that feeds the parched ground. Arthur Vance, the man the world forgot, had whispered a $40 million lesson into the ears of the future, and the world would never be the same. What would you do if you realized the person you ignored held the power to change your life forever? Is your legacy defined by what you accumulate or by what you are willing to let go? The true measure of a person is found in the shadows they cast when they think no one is watching. Subscribe to Gilded Scraps to witness more stories of hidden giants and the power of the human spirit. Remember, the most valuable lessons are often the ones we didn't know we were learning.